The request came wrapped in laughter. That was how it slipped past the warning signs. The stage lights were warm, the audience relaxed, the atmosphere deliberately loose. This was supposed to be a fun evening, stories, banter, light provocation. The kind of setting where nothing truly serious was expected to happen. Anthony Hopkins sat comfortably in his chair, hands resting loosely on his knees, listening more than speaking. He had already told a few stories, measured, self-deprecating, delivered with a dry rhythm that landed gently rather than loudly. The crowd liked him. They trusted him. That trust was exactly what made the next moment work. The host leaned forward, smiling broadly. "You know," he said, glancing toward the band, "people always talk about your intensity, about how serious you are. But I hear there's another side to you." A ripple of amused curiosity passed through the audience. Hopkins raised an eyebrow. "I'm deeply concerned already." Laughter. "Well," the host continued, clearly enjoying himself, "rumor has it you're musical." More laughter. Someone clapped ironically. "Come on," the host said, leaning into the joke. "You don't have to act all the time. Why don't you give us a little performance?" The audience laughed louder now. This was playful teasing. Harmless. Hopkins smiled politely. "What sort of performance?" he asked. "Oh, anything," the host replied quickly. "Sing, play, surprise us." A few people cheered. Others laughed again, expecting a refusal, a joke, maybe a half-hearted attempt meant to amuse and then be forgotten. This was the setup. The host had meant it as a moment of levity. One of those segments where the guest deflects with humor, the audience chuckles, and everyone moves on. Hopkins didn't respond right away. He looked toward the band, toward the piano resting quietly under the lights, then back to the host. "You're serious?" he asked. The host laughed. "As serious as I ever am." The audience laughed with him. Hopkins nodded slowly, as if considering something entirely separate from the moment. "All right," he said. The laughter continued briefly, then stopped, because Hopkins stood. Not theatrically, not to milk the moment. He rose calmly, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the piano without looking at the crowd. The host blinked. "Oh wait, you're actually..." Hopkins was already halfway there. The audience quieted, unsure whether to keep laughing. This wasn't how these bits usually went. There was no wink. No exagerati, no self-conscious shrug. Hopkins sat at the piano. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge the applause that had started and then awkwardly died. He placed his hands on the keys as if greeting an old friend. The room stilled. This wasn't a joke anymore. Hopkins closed his eyes briefly, not in performance but in alignment. A breath in, a breath out. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative. Not flashy, not designed to impress, just precise. The audience leaned forward instinctively. The host froze where he stood, one hand still half raised from the joke he'd been about to make. Hopkins played with restraint, each phrase allowed to breathe. The melody unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if he were letting the room catch up rather than dragging it along. People stopped whispering. Phones lowered. Even the band behind him stayed still, watching. This wasn't background music. It demanded attention. After a minute, Hopkins began to sing. His voice was not loud. Didn't need to be. It was clear, grounded, carried by control rather than force. The kind of voice shaped by years of listening rather than projecting. The audience's reaction shifted from curiosity to disbelief. This wasn't novelty. This wasn't charm. This was command. Hopkins sang as if the room weren't there, yet somehow included everyone. No embellishment. No flourishment to win approval. Just presence. The host's smile faded, replaced by something closer to awe. The song wasn't familiar to most people. That too was intentional. Hopkins wasn't performing recognition. He wasn't inviting the audience to sing along or feel clever for knowing the words. He was offering something private, something practiced in solitude. A few people in the front row exchanged looks. Not amused, not entertained, but struck. As if they'd been allowed into a room they hadn't expected to enter. When Hopkins reached the final line, he didn't hold the note. He let it end. The silence afterward was complete. No clapping. No cheating. Just the kind of stillness that follows something honest. Then slowly applause began. Not explosive. Earned. Hopkins stood, nodded once to the piano, and returned to his seat as calmly as he'd left it. The host stared at him. That was... He stopped, searching for words. I had no idea. Hopkins smiled faintly. That's usually the case. The audience laughed softly. Not out of humor but relief. The tension released, but the impression remained. The host tried to recover the tone. Well, he said, forcing a grin, I suppose that backfired. Hopkins shook his head. No, he said gently. It landed. The difference mattered. Backstage later, people would talk about the moment as a surprise, a revelation, an unexpected talent. But that wasn't what had stunned the audience. What stunned them was not that Anthony Hopkins could sing. It was how he'd agreed. He hadn't played along with the joke. He hadn't tried to outshine it. He had quietly redefined it. By taking something meant to be light, and treating it with seriousness. By showing that a silly request didn't require a silly response. The host would replay that moment later, alone, realizing something uncomfortable. He hadn't embarrassed Hopkins. He had underestimated him. And that realization, shared by everyone in the room, was only the beginning of what that performance would come to mean. Because the story didn't end on that stage. The real impact of what Hopkins had done would unfold afterward. Once people began asking themselves why the laughter had stopped so suddenly, that part of the story had yet to be told. The clip spread slowly, not with the frantic velocity of something scandalous, but with the quiet persistence of something people felt compelled to rewatch. It wasn't shared with laughing emojis or captions promising chaos. It was shared with a single sentence over and over again. This wasn't a joke. People watched it again, noticing what they'd missed the first time. How Anthony Hopkins didn't smile when he stood up. How he didn't look to the audience for permission. How he didn't explain himself before sitting at the piano. They noticed the absence of showmanship. The refusal to frame the moment as a trick. The host's laugh at the beginning now sounded different. Lighter than it should have been, thinner. The way it faded mid-sentence. The way his body language froze as soon as Hopkins placed his hands on the keys. That was the moment people replayed. The exact second when the room realized it had crossed into unfamiliar territory. Backstage that night, the mood was unsettled. Not tense. No one had done anything wrong but recalibrated. Producers spoke in quieter voices. Crew members lingered longer than usual, as if reluctant to disturb whatever had just passed through the space. The host found Hopkins in his dressing room later, sitting alone, jacket off, tea in hand. I owe you an apology, the host said. Hopkins looked up. For what? For making it a joke, the host replied. Hopkins considered that. You didn't, he said. You offered an opening. That wasn't what I meant. I know, Hopkins said gently. But intention doesn't own the outcome. The host exhaled. I didn't know you could do that. Hopkins smiled faintly. Most people don't. Why didn't you ever talk about it? The host asked. Because talking about it would have turned it into something else, Hopkins replied. The host nodded slowly. You weren't trying to surprise anyone. No, Hopkins said. I was trying not to diminish it. That answer stayed with the host long after Hopkins left. The next morning, headlines tried and failed to summarize what had happened. Anthony Hopkins' hidden talent goes viral. You won't believe what Anthony Hopkins did on stage. But those didn't stick. What stuck were the quieter reactions. Musicians commented on the control in his phrasing. Actors commented on the discipline it took not to perform for applause. Viewers commented on how uncomfortable it made them feel, in a good way. One comment rose to the top and stayed there. He didn't entertain us. He respected us. That was closer to the truth than most realized. Hopkins declined follow-up appearances. Declined interviews asking him to do it again. Declined offers to turn the moment into a recurring bit. That would cheapen it, he told his agent. The agent hesitated. People want more. Hopkins nodded. They always do. But this could be. Hopkins raised a hand. Finished things shouldn't be reopened just because they were noticed. That was the end of the conversation. Weeks later, a young musician wrote him a letter. Not a fan letter. Thank you. She wrote about growing up being told to make things lighter, faster, more accessible. About being encouraged to treat seriousness as a liability. She wrote that watching him accept a joke and respond with gravity had given her permission to stop apologizing for debts. Hopkins read the letter once. Then he placed it in the same drawer as the others. He didn't respond, not because he didn't care, because the act had already answered it. Years later, during a small gathering, no cameras, no press, someone finally asked him about that night. Why didn't you laugh it off? They asked. Why didn't you keep it playful? Hopkins thought for a moment. Because humor is safest when it's optional, he said. Not when it's demanded. They pressed him. But you could have embarrassed the host. Hopkins shook his head. Embarrassment comes from exposure. I didn't expose him. I exposed the assumption. What assumption? That seriousness has to justify itself, Hopkins replied. The room went quiet. He continued. When something is offered lightly, people expect it to remain light. But not everything important arrives with weight attached. Sometimes you have to supply the weight yourself. That, more than anything, explained the moment. The host hadn't asked Hopkins to perform to mock him. But the room had assumed that if he did perform, it would be small, safe, disposable. Hopkins had refused that assumption. He had taken the invitation seriously, and by doing so made everyone else confront how casually they treated things they didn't understand. The performance didn't become a turning point in his career. Didn't need to. It became something rarer. A reference point. People mentioned it years later not as a stunt but as a lesson. Remember when Hopkins did that? He didn't make it funny. He didn't explain it. He didn't repeat it. He let it stand alone. In an industry built on repetition, that restraint mattered. The audience that night hadn't been stunned because a famous actor could sing. They'd been stunned because he'd shown them something without asking for permission, and without asking for applause. He'd reminded them that not every gift is meant to be packaged as entertainment. Some are meant to be offered once, cleanly, and left alone. That was why the laughter stopped. Not because the joke failed, but because the room realized it had been invited into something real, and instinctively understood that laughter would be the wrong response. Anthony Hopkins hadn't turned the joke back on the host. He turned it inward, into craft, into discipline, into respect for the moment. And by doing so, he left the audience with something they hadn't expected to carry home with them. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. The kind that follows when something honest has been allowed to exist without commentary. That was the end of the story. No go. No explanation. Just a single moment offered fully and never repeated. And that, more than the voice, more than the surprise, was what stunned everyone.